The hallway was almost dark when Ethan noticed the door. He had pushed the janitor cart past it hundreds of times. Same gray paint, same scratched metal handle. Tonight it stood half open, just enough to spill a thin strip of light across the floor. He should have kept moving. Instead he stopped, not because of the light. Buildings like Hartwell Genomics were always glowing somewhere after hours. It was the sound behind the door, low voices, tense. The kind people use when they don't want walls to hear them. Ethan stood there with one hand on the cart handle, listening. Someone inside said a number. Then another voice answered, flat and cold. Those patients were never supposed to survive the trial anyway. The words settled in the quiet hallway like something heavy. Ethan felt his throat tighten, and without realizing it, he leaned closer to the door. The hallway had the kind of quiet that only comes after most people have gone home. Not silence exactly. Buildings like this never really slept. Air systems hummed behind the walls. Somewhere far away an elevator moved, then stopped. The faint tick of fluorescent lights filled the spaces in between. Ethan stood beside his cart and looked at the half-open door. He should have kept walking. That thought arrived a few seconds too late. Inside, someone shifted in a chair. Fabric against leather. Papers sliding across a table. The voices were clearer now. The numbers don't matter anymore, one of them said. A man's voice. Controlled. Educated. The kind that belonged to someone used to being listened to. Another voice answered, softer but sharper. They matter if anyone audits the trial. A pause. Then the first voice again. No one is going to audit it. Ethan felt his fingers tighten around the handle of the cart. The cart squeaked slightly under the pressure. He froze. The conversation inside continued, but quieter now. Words slipping together. He leaned just enough to hear again. Already signed off. Regulatory office? Handled. A chair creaked. Something about the tone made the air in Ethan's chest feel thinner. He had worked in the building for 4 years, long enough to recognize the difference between ordinary meetings and the kind people tried to hide. Most late meetings had a rhythm. Frustration. Deadlines. Tired people arguing about budgets. This wasn't that. No frustration, just calm. That calm bothered him. Ethan glanced down the hallway, empty. Cleaning shifts were like that after 10. Most of the research teams had gone home. Security usually stayed on the lower floors unless something triggered an alarm. He told himself to move. Push the cart. Turn the corner. Finish the floor. Instead, he found himself stepping closer to the door. Slow. Careful. The strip of light on the floor widened slightly as he leaned near the opening. He didn't look inside. Just listened. Patients signed consent forms, the softer voice said. Yes. And the mortality projection? A longer pause this time. Then the answer came, quiet and flat, acceptable. Ethan felt something shift in his stomach. Mortality. The word didn't belong in a casual meeting. His daughter's face appeared in his mind without warning, pale skin against a hospital pillow, the quiet machines beside her bed. He forced the thought away. Inside the room, someone tapped a pen against the table. If the data leaks, the softer voice continued, we're exposed. It won't leak. How can you be certain? A breath. Then the calm voice again, because the people who collected it won't be in a position to talk. Ethan didn't understand the words right away. They floated in the air for a moment before the meaning settled. His shoulders stiffened. Inside the room another chair moved. A third voice spoke for the first time. Lower. Older. We're wasting time. The next phase begins Monday. 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 Ethan glanced at the wall clock at the end of the corridor. 11:32 p.m. His shift ran until 2. He told himself again to walk away. But the older voice continued. The volunteers have already been scheduled. Volunteers, the softer voice repeated. The word sounded wrong, even through the door. The calm voice answered. They're terminal patients. Most of them signed up because they had nothing left to lose. Another small pause. Then the older voice said something that made Ethan's chest tighten, which makes them useful. No one laughed. No one questioned it. The sentence just sat there in the quiet room. Useful. Ethan stared at the strip of light on the floor. He thought about the hospital waiting room he had spent nights in last winter. The quiet people sitting beside plastic chairs, the tired faces, the hope that came from small chances. Useful. His hand slipped from the cart handle. The cart rolled half an inch. A wheel squeaked. Inside the room, the conversation stopped. Every sound vanished at once. Ethan held his breath. A chair moved. Footsteps. Slow. Approaching the door. His heart began beating hard enough that he was sure it could be heard through the wall. He pushed the cart forward quickly. The wheels rattled softly against the tile. Just as the door opened behind him, Ethan kept walking. Didn't turn his head. Didn't hurry. Just pushed the cart down the hallway like he had done every night for years. The footsteps stopped in the doorway behind him. Watching, he could feel it. The weight of someone standing there. Ethan reached the corner, turned, and only then allowed himself to breathe. The hallway on the next corridor looked the same as always. Gray floors, white walls, glass lab windows. Nothing had changed, but something inside him had. He finished mopping the floor near the lab entrance. His hands moved automatically. Bucket. Rinse. Mop again. The work usually helped quiet his thoughts. Tonight, it didn't. Mortality projection. Acceptable. Useful. The words repeated in his head in pieces. He tried to push them away. Maybe he misunderstood. Maybe it was just technical language. Research companies talk differently, numbers and probabilities instead of people. Still, the tone of that calm voice wouldn't leave him alone. Around midnight, he emptied the trash bins near the research offices. Most of the doors were locked. Lights off. Computer screens dark. Normal. At the end of the row sat the door he had passed earlier. Closed now. No light underneath. He slowed without meaning to, then kept moving. His cart reached the elevator lobby. He pressed the button. While waiting, he noticed something on the floor near the wall. A sheet of paper, half folded, probably dropped when someone left earlier. He picked it up automatically. Part of the job. The page had a company header, Hartwell Genomics. Below it sat a table of printed names and numbers. Ethan didn't mean to read it, but his eyes paused on one line. Patient ID, HG4172 trial phase 2 projected outcome, non-viable. He frowned. The word looked clinical. Detached, non-viable. He turned the page slightly. Another line. HG4175, non-viable. Another, HG4178, non-viable. The elevator doors opened beside him with a soft chime. Ethan folded the paper slowly. For a moment he stood there with it in his hand. Then he slipped it into the pocket of his work jacket. The elevator doors closed, and as the car began to move downward, Ethan realized something that made the quiet space feel suddenly smaller. He had spent years believing he worked in one of the best medical research companies in the country, a place trying to save people. Tonight was the first time that belief had started to crack. The elevator hummed softly as it moved. Ethan stood with his back against the wall, hands resting on the handle of the cart. The building passed floor by floor beneath him. A small digital number changed above the door. Normally, he liked the elevator. It was one of the few places in the building where he could pause without feeling watched. A small pocket of stillness between hallways. Tonight it felt different. Smaller. His jacket pocket pressed against his ribs where the folded paper sat. He was aware of it in a way that made him uncomfortable, like carrying something that didn't belong to him. The elevator stopped at the 9th floor. The doors opened. No one waited outside. Just a dim corridor and the faint smell of disinfectant drifting through the air. Ethan pushed the cart forward and stepped out. This floor was quieter than most. Administrative offices, a few conference rooms, no active labs. Cleaning it usually took less than 20 minutes. He started at the far end. Trash bins first, then surfaces. The routine had settled into his muscles over the years. Wipe, rinse, move on. But tonight his thoughts kept returning to the conversation upstairs. Patience, mortality projections, acceptable. He tried to tell himself he didn't understand the context. Clinical trials were complicated. People signed up knowing the risks. Doctors talked in numbers because they had to. Still, the word useful came back again. Not patients, not volunteers. Useful. The hallway lights flickered slightly as the building system adjusted for the late hour. Ethan wiped down a conference table and moved to the next room. The paper in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. He ignored it for as long as he could, about 10 minutes. Then he stopped beside a window overlooking the parking lot. The city outside had settled into its midnight rhythm. A few distant headlights, the long, quiet stretch of empty roads. He took the folded page out. Just for a second, he told himself that. The paper crackled softly as he unfolded it, rows of names. Or not names exactly. Patient IDs, numbers where people should have been. Beside each ID sat columns of notes, dosage levels, response markers, trial stages. Most of it meant nothing to him. But the last column was easy to read. Projected outcome. Some lines said uncertain. A few said monitoring. Many said the same word he had seen earlier. Non-viable. Ethan's thumb rested against the edge of the page. He counted without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 7, 12. More than half the page carried the same word. He felt a slow pressure building in his chest. Not panic. Something quieter than that. A heavy kind of discomfort that made it hard to breathe deeply. He folded the paper again, slower this time. His daughter's hospital room returned to his thoughts before he could stop it. Laya sitting up against the pillows, the thin blanket across her legs, her voice trying to sound brave when the doctor explained things she didn't fully understand. Experimental options, limited chances, careful language that avoided the word dying. Ethan rubbed his thumb against the edge of the paper. Maybe this list had nothing to do with what he heard upstairs. Maybe it was routine documentation. He placed the paper back into his pocket. Finished cleaning the 9th floor. Moved to the 8th. The building grew quieter the lower he went. Fewer lights, fewer locked doors. Just long hallways and the steady rhythm of the cartwheels moving across tile. Around 1 in the morning, he reached the employee break room near the security office. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee. A single overhead light glowed above the counter. Ethan set the cart beside the wall and poured himself a cup from the machine. The coffee tasted bitter, but the warmth helped settle his hands. He sat at the small table near the window. For a while he just held the cup, watching steam drift upward. Across the room, the security monitor displayed camera feeds from around the building. Most of the screens showed empty corridors. One camera displayed the hallway from earlier, the door where the meeting had taken place. Closed now. Dark. Ethan stared at it longer than he meant to. He wondered who had been inside that room. Executives, maybe. Research directors. People whose names appeared in company newsletters and annual reports. People far above janitors. His phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. The sudden vibration made him jump slightly. He pulled it out. A message. From home. Just 2 words. She's sleeping. It was from his sister Mara. She stayed with Laya most nights when Ethan worked late shifts. He read the message twice, then typed back, "Thank you." A few seconds passed. Another message appeared. Doctor called earlier. Ethan felt his shoulders tense. He waited. The next message arrived. "They're still reviewing treatment options." He stared at the words. Still reviewing. That careful language again. He typed slowly. Okay. Then he placed the phone face down on the table. The room felt quieter now. After a moment he stood, poured the rest of the coffee down the sink, and returned to his cart. Work helped. Movement helped. He finished the 8th floor, then the 7th. By the time he reached the lobby level, it was nearly 2 in the morning. The building had settled into complete stillness. Security lights glowed softly across the polished floor. Ethan emptied the last trash bag into the disposal room and rinsed his mop bucket. Routine. Always the same steps. He hung the mop to dry and pushed the cart toward the staff exit. Just before reaching the door, he stopped. His hand moved into his pocket again. The folded paper brushed against his fingers. For a moment, he considered throwing it away, dropping it into the bin beside the door and forgetting about it completely. That would be the smart thing. He was a janitor. Whatever those executives were discussing had nothing to do with him. People lost jobs for asking questions about things they didn't understand. People like him didn't get second chances. His hand remained in the pocket. The hallway felt unusually still. Then he pulled the paper out again. Looked at the lines one more time. HG4172, HG4172, HG4175, HG4172, numbers standing where people should have been. He folded the page carefully, placed it back into his jacket. Then he turned off the break room light and stepped out into the cool, early morning air. The parking lot was nearly empty. His old car sat beneath a dim street lamp near the far end. Ethan walked toward it slowly. The night air felt colder than usual. Somewhere in the distance, a siren passed through the sleeping city. He unlocked the car and sat behind the wheel. For a few minutes, he didn't start the engine. Just sat there, hands resting against the steering wheel, the paper pressed against his chest inside the jacket pocket. Finally, he turned the key. The engine started with a tired rumble. As he pulled out of the lot, one thought kept circling quietly in the back of his mind. He had only overheard a few sentences, only seen one page, and yet something inside him already understood a simple truth he wished he could ignore. Whatever was happening inside Hartwell Genomics was not meant for people like him to see. The building looked the same the next night. Same glass front reflecting the streetlights. Same quiet lobby. Same faint smell of disinfectant and polished floors. Nothing about Hartwell Genomics suggested that anything was wrong. People in lab coats moved through the entrance with tired expressions and coffee cups in their hands. Security guards nodded at employees they recognized. The reception desk glowed softly beneath its overhead lights. Ethan pushed his cart through the service entrance just before 10. The wheels made their usual soft rattling sound across the tile. He hung his jacket in the staff locker room, then stopped. The folded paper was still inside the pocket. He had taken it out twice the night before after getting home, once at the kitchen table, once beside Lia's hospital bed when she finally fell asleep. Both times he had read the same lines, the same numbers, the same word. Non-viable. Now the page rested against the inside of the locker door where he had placed it carefully. He looked at it for a long moment, then folded it again and slipped it back into his jacket. Leaving it here didn't feel right, but carrying it didn't feel right either. He closed the locker. The metal door clicked softly. Across the room, one of the other night cleaners, Jorge, was tying the strings of a trash bag. "Evening," Jorge said without looking up. Ethan nodded. "Evening." Jorge glanced over. "You look like you didn't sleep." Ethan shrugged slightly. "Just tired." Jorge laughed quietly. "That's the job." He lifted the trash bag and walked toward the disposal door. "See you upstairs?" Ethan picked up his card. The routine began again. Lobby, then the research floors. The elevator ride felt longer tonight. He watched the floor numbers climb. 3, 4, 5. His mind kept returning to the hallway where the meeting had taken place. He told himself it didn't matter. He had work to do. The elevator doors opened on the 6th floor. Labs. This level always stayed active later than the others. Several doors still glowed with light. Equipment hummed behind glass windows. A pair of researchers walked past him speaking quietly about data sets. Normal conversation. Normal work. Ethan cleaned the hallway slowly. The building smelled faintly of chemical solvents and sterile wipes. At the end of the corridor sat the same door from the night before. Closed. No light underneath. He paused beside it longer than necessary, then moved on. Inside one of the nearby labs, 2 technicians stood beside a monitor. "Trial response is lower than projected," one of them said. "Phase adjustment," the other asked. "Maybe." They didn't lower their voices, didn't look concerned. Just another problem inside another experiment. Ethan wiped fingerprints from the glass window and continued pushing the cart. A few minutes later, he reached the stairwell door. He usually used the stairs to move between floors instead of waiting for elevators. Quieter. Faster. He pushed the door open and started down. The stairwell echoed softly with each step. Concrete walls. Metal railings. The distant hum of machinery somewhere in the building's lower levels. Halfway down he stopped. Someone was coming up from below. Footsteps. Two sets. Voices. He stepped aside near the landing so they could pass. The men appeared around the corner a moment later, both wearing dark suits instead of lab coats. Executives, the kind who usually used private elevators instead of stairwells. They slowed when they saw him. Just slightly. Then continued climbing. Their conversation paused until they passed. Ethan kept his eyes down. Janitors learned that habit early. People talked more freely when they felt invisible. The two men reached the landing above him. Then one of them spoke again, quieter but still audible in the narrow stairwell. If Phase 3 begins next week, we'll need the results finalized. The other man answered. They'll be finalized. What about Hartwell? A small pause. Then the reply came, low and steady. She doesn't need to know the details. The first man hesitated. That might be a problem if her brother... The second voice cut him off. It won't be. Their footsteps continued upward. The door above opened, closed again. The stairwell returned to silence. Ethan stood very still. Hartwell. The name carried weight inside the building. Vivian Hartwell. Founder's daughter. Current CEO. Her photo hung in the lobby near the company timeline. Confident expression. Sharp eyes. Her reputation for rebuilding the company after her father died. People respected her, feared her a little, but those men had spoken about her as if she were outside something, not in control of it. And then there had been the other sentence, if her brother... The rest of the thought lingered unfinished in Ethan's mind. He continued down the stairs slowly. Each step felt heavier. At the bottom level, he stepped back into the hallway and pushed his cart forward. For the next half hour, he focused on cleaning. Simple tasks. Trash. Floors. Disinfecting handles, but his thoughts kept drifting. The list in his pocket. The conversation in the stairwell. The meeting behind the half-open door. Small pieces, none of them complete, yet together they formed something uncomfortable. Around 11:30, Ethan reached the clinical records office. This floor stored patient documentation for ongoing trials. Most of the cabinets were locked behind glass doors and keycard systems. Normally, he cleaned the outer hallway and left. Tonight, he slowed. Through the glass, he could see shelves of labeled folders, rows of trial codes, HG identifiers similar to the ones on the paper in his pocket. He stood there longer than he should have. A voice spoke behind him. You looking for something? Ethan turned. A woman stood near the doorway with a tablet in her hand. Late 30s, maybe. Lab coat. Dark hair tied back neatly. Her eyes moved from Ethan to the cart and back again. Just cleaning, he said. She studied him for a second longer, then nodded. Right. She stepped past him and opened the office door with a keycard. The lock beeped softly. Ethan pushed the cart forward again. But as he passed the glass window, he heard the woman speaking quietly to someone inside the office. I don't like the mortality projections. A man answered from somewhere deeper in the room. None of us do. So why are we continuing? Silence followed. Then the man spoke again. Because the board already approved it. Ethan kept walking. His heartbeat had picked up again. Inside his jacket pocket, the folded paper pressed against his chest like a quiet reminder. The building still looked the same polished floors, the same calm voices. But tonight, Ethan noticed something he had never paid attention to before. People weren't arguing about whether the trials should continue. They were only discussing how. Ethan finished the clinical records floor a little after midnight. The hallway lights dimmed automatically as he pushed the cart toward the elevator lobby. The building system lowered power during late hours, leaving the corridors lit by softer bulbs that cast longer shadows across the floor. He pressed the elevator button. Waited. While he stood there, his eyes drifted again to the glass office behind him. The woman inside had moved deeper into the room. Ethan could see only her reflection now, faint in the glass, speaking quietly with the man he couldn't see. Their voices were too low to understand anymore. Still, something about the way she stood, arms folded tightly across her chest, made it clear she wasn't comfortable with whatever they were discussing. The elevator doors opened. Ethan stepped inside. The ride down to the fourth floor took less than 10 seconds. But during that short descent, the quiet pressure in his chest returned. It had been building since the night before, small pieces stacking together. A sentence overheard in a stairwell. A list of patient IDs. Researchers speaking in careful tones about mortality projections. None of it was proof of anything, but it didn't feel normal. The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto the clinical testing wing. This floor was different from the others. Less glass, more locked doors. The hall smelled stronger, here cleaner, sharper, like antiseptic and cold metal. Ethan pushed the cart forward slowly. Most of the lights were already off. Only a few rooms near the far end remained active. He cleaned the waiting area first. A row of empty chairs, a small reception desk, a television mounted on the wall showing the muted medical news channel. The headlines scrolling across the bottom of the screen caught his eye. Experimental treatments offer new hope for terminal patients. Ethan watched the silent footage of smiling doctors and hopeful families. Then he turned the television off. The room fell quiet again. He moved down the hallway, room by room, disinfecting handles, emptying bins. The routine steadied his breathing until he reached the observation corridor. The door here required a staff badge. Ethan usually cleaned the outer hallway only, but tonight the door was slightly open. Not wide, just enough that the latch hadn't caught. Inside, a row of narrow windows looked into the testing rooms. Dim lights glowed through the glass. Machines blinked quietly. Ethan hesitated, then pushed the door gently. It opened with a soft click. The corridor inside smelled stronger than the rest of the floor. Medical alcohol. Plastic tubing. Something metallic beneath it. He stepped inside. His shoes made soft sounds against the polished tile. The first window showed an empty room. A hospital bed. IV stand. Monitoring equipment. Clean. Prepared. The second room looked the same. The third room was occupied. Ethan stopped. A man lay on the bed inside. Thin, older, gray hair against the pillow. A clear oxygen line rested beneath his nose. Electrodes were attached to his chest, feeding data into a monitor beside the bed. The man wasn't asleep. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. For a moment, Ethan thought he hadn't been noticed. Then the man turned his head slightly toward the window. Their eyes met. Ethan felt a sudden awkwardness, like he had stepped somewhere he shouldn't be. He lifted his hand slightly in an uncertain gesture. The man looked at him quietly, then gave a small nod. Not a greeting exactly, just acknowledgement. Ethan nodded back. Then he continued walking. The fourth room held another patient. A woman this time, younger. Her arm rested beside her body with an IV line running into it. A clear bag of fluid hung above the bed. Her breathing looked shallow but steady. The monitor beside her blinked slowly. Ethan stood there for a few seconds. These must be the volunteers the executives had mentioned. Terminal patients, people who had signed up because they had nothing left to lose. He thought about the list again. HG4172, HG4172, HG4175. Numbers replacing names. A quiet voice came from behind him. "You're not supposed to be in here." Ethan turned quickly. A nurse stood near the corridor entrance. She didn't sound angry, just tired. He stepped back toward the door. "Sorry," he said. The door was open. She nodded. "That happens sometimes." Her eyes moved briefly toward the patient rooms, then back to Ethan. "They're resting." "I understand." He pushed the cart out of the corridor. The nurse closed the door behind him and swiped her badge across the lock. The light turned red. Ethan continued down the hallway. His chest felt tight again. Not from fear, from something else. He had seen patients in hospitals before, plenty of times, but seeing them here inside the quiet halls of a research company felt different, more distant, less human somehow. Like pieces inside a larger machine. He finished cleaning the fourth floor, then moved down to the third. By the time he reached the lobby level again, it was nearly 2 in the morning. The building had gone completely still. Even the labs upstairs had gone dark. Ethan rinsed his mop bucket and returned the supplies to the storage room. The routine movements felt heavier tonight. Before leaving, he stopped in the locker room. The folded page came out of his jacket again. He unfolded it slowly under the fluorescent light. The rows of patient IDs stared back at him. His eyes moved to the first line again. HG4172. For a moment, he pictured the older man in the third room upstairs. The way he had looked through the glass. Calm, almost resigned. Ethan looked back at the paper. There was no way to know if the man's number appeared on this list. Still, the thought settled uncomfortably in his mind. He folded the page again, carefully, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket instead of the outer one. Closer, the locker door shut with a soft metal click. Outside, the early morning air felt colder than the night before. Ethan walked across the parking lot toward his car. His footsteps echoed faintly between the empty rows. He unlocked the door and sat behind the wheel. For a moment, he just stared through the windshield. The building stood silent behind him, glass walls reflecting the pale streetlights. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a place trying to save lives. Ethan started the engine. As the car pulled out of the lot, one thought settled quietly in the back of his mind. He still didn't know what the truth was, but he knew one thing now with uncomfortable certainty. The people running those trials upstairs were not asking whether patients might die. They had already accepted it. The third night felt heavier before Ethan even reached the building. He noticed it while sitting in his car outside the hospital. The engine was off. The windshield fogged slightly from his breath. Inside the room above, the lights were dim except for the soft glow near Lia's bed. She had fallen asleep not long after dinner. Her breathing had been steady, slow, but there were new bruises on her arm where the nurses had searched for veins earlier that day. Ethan had pretended not to notice while she talked about a cartoon she liked. Children learned to avoid certain subjects. Adults did the same. He checked the time. 9:32 p.m. His shift started soon. Still, he sat there for another minute, watching the hospital window. Then he started the car and drove toward Hartwell Genomics. The lobby looked quieter than usual when he arrived. The reception desk lights were dimmer. Only one security guard sat behind the monitor wall tonight. Ethan nodded as he passed. Evening. The guard returned the nod. Evening. Nothing unusual. Just another night. Ethan pushed the cart toward the elevator and rode up to the 6th floor. The doors opened. The hallway smelled the same as always, clean chemicals and filtered air. But tonight, Ethan noticed how quiet the place felt. Even the labs were darker than usual. He moved through the corridor slowly, wiping down the glass panels along the research rooms. His thoughts drifted back to the observation rooms downstairs. The patients, the quiet machines, the word useful. He tried to push it away again. Focus on the work. That usually helped. Halfway down the hallway, he heard voices. 2 researchers standing near a workstation. They weren't whispering, just speaking in low, tired voices like people finishing a long shift. The dosage increase doesn't make sense, one of them said. It wasn't our call. But the toxicity data, I know. A pause. The first researcher rubbed his face with one hand. If someone dies during phase 3, the second man answered without looking up from the tablet in his hand. They already accounted for that. Ethan kept walking. His cartwheels rolled softly across the floor. Neither researcher paid attention to him. That was normal. Janitors blended into the background, invisible until something needed cleaning. He wiped the workstation surfaces and continued toward the stairwell. Tonight, he chose the stairs again instead of the elevator. Partly out of habit, partly because the stairwell let him hear things people didn't expect him to hear. He pushed the heavy door open. Concrete walls, cool air. His footsteps echoed faintly as he started down. 2 floors passed in silence. Then voices again, this time coming from below. He slowed. A man was speaking on a phone. No, the schedule can't change now. The voice was calm, measured. Ethan recognized the tone immediately. The the same calm voice he had heard through the half-open door 2 nights earlier. He stopped on the landing above. The man stood one level down near the stairwell window, tall, dark suit, back turned. Ethan remained still. The man continued speaking quietly into the phone. Yes, the brother is already in the program. Ethan felt his shoulders tighten. No, he doesn't know the full protocol. A pause. The man shifted slightly. Ethan saw part of his profile now. Sharp features, confident posture, executive. The voice continued. As long as Phase 3 proceeds on schedule, the outcome won't matter. Another pause. Then the sentence that made Ethan's chest go tight. Terminal patients were selected for a reason. The call ended. The man slipped the phone into his pocket. For a moment he stood there looking through the stairwell window at the city lights outside. Then he turned. Ethan stepped back automatically. The man climbed the stairs past him without hesitation. His eyes moved over Ethan briefly. Just a glance, then he continued upward. The door above opened. Closed again. Ethan stayed on the landing for several seconds. His heartbeat had picked up. The brother is already in the program. The words repeated quietly in his head. Brother. Earlier that night he had heard the executives mention someone else. What about Hartwell, if her brother? He had dismissed the thought at the time. But now the pieces fell closer together. Vivian Hartwell, CEO of the company. And apparently, her brother was part of the trial. Ethan leaned against the stairwell railing. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Not panic, not exactly fear. Something heavier, because if the CEO didn't know the full protocol, then the people running the trial were hiding something even from her. He finished the stairwell descent slowly. The fourth-floor hallway waited beyond the door. The clinical testing wing. Same antiseptic smell, same quiet hum of equipment. Ethan pushed the cart forward. Tonight, the observation corridor door was fully closed. The red lock light glowed beside it. Inside, the patients would still be there. Sleeping. Waiting. Machines measuring numbers that determined their future. He stood outside the door longer than he should have. Then he turned away. The rest of the floor passed in routine motions. Trash bags, mopping, disinfectant wipes. But his thoughts stayed with the stairwell conversation. The brother. Inside the program. Someone important. Someone whose survival might actually matter to the executives if the truth came out. Around midnight, Ethan stepped into the break room for coffee. The security monitors flickered quietly along the wall. Most showed empty hallways. One displayed the observation corridor. 2 nurses moving between rooms. A doctor checking a chart. Normal. But Ethan noticed something else. A new name had appeared on the digital patient board in the corner of the screen. Room 7. Admission, K. Hartwell. Ethan's hand stopped halfway to the coffee machine. Hartwell. He looked closer at the monitor. The name remained there. Short. Unmistakable. K. Hartwell. For a moment, Ethan felt the quiet pressure in his chest return stronger than before. The brother. Inside the trial. And suddenly Ethan understood something that made the room feel colder. If the executives were willing to sacrifice terminal patients, and they had hidden the protocol even from the CEO, then the person in room 7 might not know what he had been placed into. Ethan stood in the break room longer than he realized. The coffee machine hummed quietly beside him, still waiting for the button he had never pressed. On the security monitor, the observation corridor camera remained steady. Nurses moving in and out of rooms. Soft blue lights from the machines. Room numbers above each door. Room 7 sat near the far end of the hallway. The digital board beside the camera continued to show the same name. K. Hartwell. Ethan swallowed slowly. The name didn't belong on a list like that. Not in a place where people spoke about mortality projections as if they were routine numbers. He turned away from the screen, picked up the cup, pressed the coffee button. The machine sputtered. Dark liquid filled the cup halfway before he stopped it. His hands felt colder than usual. He took one sip, barely tasted it. Across the room, the security guard's chair sat empty. Whoever had been monitoring the cameras had stepped away. The quiet felt heavier because of it. Ethan looked at the monitor again. Room 7. He told himself to leave it alone, finish the shift, go home, but the sentence from the stairwell kept repeating. He doesn't know the full protocol. Ethan set the cup down, walked back toward the hallway. His cart waited where he had left it. The wheels rolled softly as he pushed it down the corridor toward the clinical wing. The observation door still showed the red lock light. He stopped beside it. His hand rested on the handle. For a moment he stood there listening. Nothing, just the faint hum of equipment inside. He turned away, continued pushing the cart. 10 steps down the hallway he stopped again. The hallway lights flickered faintly. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Then he turned back. The nurse from earlier stepped out of the observation area just as he reached the door. She looked surprised to see him again. "You're still working this floor?" Ethan nodded. "Almost done." She rubbed the back of her neck. Long shift written across her face. He hesitated before speaking. "New patient tonight?" She glanced toward the door, then back at him. "Why?" Ethan shrugged slightly. Saw the board on the security monitor. The nurse sighed quietly. "Yeah." She leaned against the wall for a moment. "Late admission. Trial volunteer?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Something like that." Ethan studied her expression. She didn't look comfortable, more tired than anything. But there was something else beneath it. Concern, maybe. "Family know he's here?" Ethan asked. She looked at him sharply. "That's not something we discuss in hallways." He raised his hand slightly. "Sorry." She watched him for another second, then spoke more quietly. "Everyone signs consent forms." Ethan nodded, but the words from the stairwell echoed again. "He doesn't know the full protocol." The nurse pushed herself away from the wall. "I've got rounds." She stepped back through the door and scanned her badge. The lock beeped. The door opened. For a second, Ethan could see down the corridor again. Room lights, monitors, machines blinking quietly. Room 7 near the far end. Then the door closed. Red light again. Ethan stood there, staring at the handle. His mind moved through possibilities he didn't like. Maybe everything was legitimate. Maybe the executives had simply been discussing risks. But if the CEO's brother had been placed inside a trial without knowing something important, that wasn't risk, that was deception. And deception inside medical trials meant people died. He pushed the cart away from the door, forced himself to finish the rest of the hallway. By the time he returned to the lobby, it was close to 2 in the morning again. The building had gone quiet, almost completely dark. Ethan returned the supplies to the storage room and washed his hands at the sink. Cold water, steady breathing. He dried his hands slowly, then walked toward the exit. The lobby lights dimmed automatically as he passed. Outside, the parking lot waited in the pale glow of street lamps. His car sat near the same spot as the previous nights. He unlocked it and sat behind the wheel. But this time he didn't start the engine. Instead, he reached into his jacket. The folded patient list came out again. He opened it carefully beneath the dim interior light. Rows of IDs, trial phases, projected outcomes. His eyes moved down the page slowly. HG4172, 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 HG4172. Then, near the bottom, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A line added later. The ink slightly darker than the rest. HG4193 trial phase, 3A projected outcome. Pending. Ethan stared at the number. He looked up at the hospital wing in the distance across the city. Then, back at the paper. Room 7. K. Hartwell. A quiet realization settled in his chest. That number hadn't been listed the night he found this page, which meant someone had added it recently. Very recently. Ethan folded the paper slowly, placed it back into his pocket. Then he started the car. As he drove out of the lot, the thought that followed him through the empty streets felt heavier than anything he had carried so far. Because if Kieran Hartwell had just been added to the trial, then whatever phase 3 was about to begin, it hadn't started yet. And once it did, it might already be too late to warn anyone. Ethan didn't sleep much that morning. He tried. After dropping by the hospital to see Laya, he went home, closed the curtains, and lay down on the couch like he usually did between night shifts. But sleep never fully arrived. His mind kept circling the same things. The list. The conversation in the stairwell. Room 7. K. Hartwell. He turned once, then again. The room stayed quiet except for the slow ticking of the wall clock. Around noon he gave up. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and unfolded the paper again. The creases had started to weaken from being opened so many times. His eyes went straight to the newest line. HG4193. Phase 3A. Projected outcome, pending. Everything above that line carried some form of expectation. Monitoring, uncertain, non-viable. But this one was blank. Waiting. Ethan rubbed his thumb along the edge of the paper. If Phase 3 hadn't started yet, that meant whatever decision those executives had made was still ahead. Not finished. Still moving. Still preventable. He folded the page again. The hospital was only 10 minutes away. Visiting hours had just started. He picked up his keys. Laya was awake when he entered the room. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed with a coloring book spread across the blanket. Her hair looked thinner than it had a few months ago. She tried to keep it tied back, like it didn't bother her. "Hey," she said when she saw him. Ethan smiled. "Hey." He pulled the chair closer to the bed. "What are we working on today?" She turned the page toward him. A half-colored dragon filled the paper. "It's supposed to be green," she said, "but I ran out." Ethan studied the picture seriously. "Could be blue." She considered that. "Maybe." They sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked the question she always asked. "Did you work late?" "Yeah. Cleaning again. Same as always." She nodded, satisfied. Children didn't need complicated answers. A nurse stepped into the room briefly to check the IV line. Routine. The same careful movements Ethan had seen hundreds of times. After the nurse left, Laya leaned back against the pillow. "Doctor said they're still looking for another treatment." Ethan felt the familiar pressure behind his ribs. He kept his voice steady. "That's good." She watched his face. Kids were good at reading things adults tried to hide. "Does it cost a lot?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "Don't worry about that." She accepted the answer the way children often did when they knew pushing wouldn't help. Instead, she handed him a blue crayon. "You finish the wings." Ethan colored slowly, careful strokes. Inside the lines. When he left the hospital an hour later, the afternoon light outside felt strangely bright. He stood in the parking lot for a moment before getting into his car. The folded paper pressed against his chest again inside his jacket. A thought had been forming quietly since morning, one he had tried to ignore. But it kept returning. If Vivian Hartwell didn't know what was happening inside her own company, then someone needed to tell her. The idea felt absurd the moment it finished forming. A janitor walking into the CEO's office with a story about overheard conversations and a stolen document. People lost jobs for less, but if the trial was about to begin, and if her brother was part of it, Ethan started the car. The engine idled quietly. He stared at the hospital building in the rearview mirror. Then he drove back toward Hartwell Genomics. His shift didn't start for another 3 hours. The building looked different in daylight. Employees moved in and out through the main entrance. Delivery trucks rolled through the service lane. Everything looked normal. Professional. Efficient. Ethan parked across the street, sat there watching the front doors. Vivian Hartwell's photo hung inside the lobby. He had seen it many times while mopping the floor beneath it. Sharp eyes, confident posture. A leader people trusted. If she truly didn't know about the trial, then someone inside the company had gone to great lengths to hide it. Ethan stepped out of the car, crossed the street slowly. The front desk receptionist looked up when he entered. "Yes? I'm looking for Ms. Hartwell," Ethan said. The receptionist blinked. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." Her polite smile tightened slightly. "Then you'll need to schedule one." Ethan hesitated, then reached into his jacket and unfolded the paper just enough to reveal the patient ID column. "I think she'll want to see this." The receptionist frowned. What exactly is it? I'm not sure, Ethan admitted, but it has her brother's name on it. The change in her expression was immediate, professional calm replaced by quiet concern. She studied Ethan carefully. You work here? Night cleaning crew. She glanced at the paper again, then picked up the phone. Ethan stood there while she spoke quietly to someone upstairs. The lobby noise continued around him. Footsteps, muted conversations, the soft hum of computers. After a minute, she hung up. Someone from her office will meet you. Ethan nodded. He waited near the reception desk. His hands felt unusually still, not shaking, just steady in a way that surprised him. 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened. A tall woman stepped into the lobby. Dark suit, confident stride, the same face from the photo on the wall. Vivian Hartwell stopped a few feet away from him. Her eyes moved from Ethan to the folded paper in his hand. You said this involves my brother. Her voice was calm, but there was something sharp beneath it. Ethan nodded. Yes. She extended her hand. Let me see it. He passed the page carefully. Her eyes scanned the document quickly, then slowed. The calm expression on her face changed slightly. Not shock, recognition. She looked back at Ethan. Where did you get this? I found it during my shift. Her gaze held his for a moment, assessing, calculating. Then she folded the paper once, tighter than before. Come upstairs, she said quietly. Ethan followed her toward the elevator. As the doors closed behind them, one thought settled firmly in his mind. For the first time since he overheard that meeting, someone inside Hartwell Genomics was finally listening. The elevator moved smoothly. No music, no announcements, just the quiet mechanical rise through the building. Ethan stood beside Vivian Hartwell without speaking. She held the folded page in one hand, reading it again. Her face stayed controlled, but something in the way her jaw tightened told Ethan the document meant more to her than she had expected. The elevator stopped on the executive floor. The doors opened onto a quiet hallway covered in thick carpet instead of tile. The air smelled different, here less chemical, more polished wood and office furniture. Vivian walked ahead without looking back. Her office door opened with a soft click. Inside, she said. Ethan stepped in. The room was larger than he expected, but simple. A desk, 2 chairs, a long window looking over the city. No clutter. No decorations except a framed photo near the edge of the desk. A younger version of Vivian stood in the photo beside a man Ethan recognized from company history displays her father. And between them stood another man, smiling. Kieran Hartwell. Vivian closed the door behind them. She walked to the desk, unfolded the page again, and laid it flat. Tell me everything, she said. Ethan hesitated for a moment. Then he began. He described the hallway, the half-open door, the voices he overheard that first night. He repeated the words as closely as he could remember them. Mortality projections. Patients never meant to survive. Executives discussing outcomes like they were numbers. Vivian didn't interrupt. She only listened. When he finished describing the stairwell conversation, she looked up. You're sure, they said, my brother was part of the trial? Yes. And that he didn't know the full protocol? Yes. The room fell quiet. Vivian looked down at the document again. Her finger moved slowly along the lines. Then she spoke quietly. This page shouldn't exist. Ethan waited. She continued. Patient outcome projections are restricted to a very small research group. Even the board doesn't normally see them. Her finger stopped on the newest line, HG4193, her brother's entry. This was added yesterday. Ethan nodded. I think phase 3 starts soon. Vivian leaned back in the chair. For a moment she closed her eyes. Not long. Just long enough that Ethan could see the weight settling behind them. When she opened them again, the calm executive had returned. Which observation room is he in? 7. She stood immediately. We're going downstairs. The clinical testing floor looked different during the day. More staff, more activity. Doctors moving quickly between rooms. Monitors displaying charts and patient data, but the observation corridor door was the same. Locked. Vivian walked straight toward it. A nurse standing nearby looked surprised when she approached. Ms. Hartwell. Vivian held up the document. Open the door. The nurse hesitated, then scanned her badge. The lock beeped. The door opened. The observation corridor stretched quietly ahead. Room lights. Machines blinking steadily. Vivian walked straight to room 7. Ethan followed a few steps behind. Through the window they could see him. Kieran Hartwell looked thinner than the photo in the office, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Same sharp features, same dark hair. He was sitting upright in the bed, reading something on a tablet. Vivian pushed the door open. Kieran. He looked up. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. Then recognition. Viv? His voice sounded hoarse. What are you doing here? She stepped inside. What treatment did they tell you this was? Kieran frowned slightly. Experimental therapy trial. Phase 2. Vivian's expression hardened. They told you Phase 2. Yeah. Did they explain the toxicity projections? Kieran shook his head slowly. No. Why would they? Vivian held up the document. Because we're not in Phase 2 anymore. He looked at the page. His eyes moved across the lines, then stopped. Phase 3. He looked up again. What is this? Before Vivian could answer, footsteps approached behind them. 2 men in suits entered the corridor. Ethan recognized one of them immediately. The calm voice from the stairwell. The man stopped when he saw Vivian. Ms. Hartwell. Vivian didn't turn. You were planning to start Phase 3 tomorrow. The man remained composed. Yes, without informing the patient. He signed consent. For Phase 2. A quiet pause settled between them. The man's eyes moved briefly to Ethan, then back to Vivian. These trials save lives. Vivian's voice stayed calm. Not according to these projections. She held the page up again. The man didn't deny it. Instead, he said something that made the corridor feel colder. Terminal patients accept certain risks. Vivian's eyes sharpened. My brother is not a risk calculation. He volunteered. You altered the protocol. Silence. For the first time, the man's calm expression shifted slightly. Phase 3 provides stronger data. Vivian stepped closer to him. Did the board approve that change? Another pause. That was answer enough. Vivian turned to Ethan. Stay here. Then she walked past the 2 men and down the corridor, her phone already in her hand. The suited man watched her go, then looked at Ethan again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, the man said quietly, You should have kept cleaning floors. Ethan didn't answer. Inside room 7, Kieran sat on the bed staring at the document. The monitors beside him continued blinking steadily. Outside the building, somewhere beyond the glass walls, the afternoon traffic moved through the city like nothing had changed. But inside Hartwell Genomics, something had already begun to shift, and the people responsible were starting to realize that the quiet janitor who overheard one conversation had just opened a door they could no longer close. The building didn't feel the same after that day. Not immediately. At first, everything continued as if nothing had happened. Researchers still walked the hallways carrying tablets and lab reports. Machines still hummed behind glass doors. The reception desk still greeted visitors with the same polite calm, but something underneath had shifted. Ethan noticed it the next night when he returned for his shift. Security had doubled. 2 guards stood near the elevators where there had only been one before. Another sat behind the monitor wall watching every camera feed more closely than usual. When Ethan pushed his cart through the service entrance, one of them glanced up. Evening. Ethan nodded. Evening. The guard studied him a second longer than necessary. Word had started moving through the building. Quietly. Not in announcements or emails. Just in small conversations that stopped when someone else walked into the room. Ethan heard fragments while cleaning. Board meeting scheduled. Legal review. Protocol violations. People weren't speaking loudly, but they were speaking differently. Carefully. Room 7 no longer held Kieran Hartwell. Ethan saw that on the monitor screen before he even reached the clinical floor. The digital board showed the room marked vacant. He stood in the break room for a moment, watching the camera feed. Machines had been removed, the bed stripped, nurses moving equipment out of the space. Kieran had been moved somewhere else. Safe, Ethan hoped. The thought gave him a small moment of relief he hadn't realized he needed. He poured coffee and sat down. Across the screen, the observation corridor looked quieter than usual. Several rooms had been emptied. Not all of them, but enough to make it noticeable. The door opened behind him. Vivian Hartwell stepped into the break room. She wasn't wearing the dark executive suit from the day before, just a simple gray jacket and tired eyes that hadn't slept much. She looked at Ethan. "Mind if I sit?" He shook his head. "No." She took the chair across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The monitors flickered quietly. Finally, she said, "My brother is stable." Ethan nodded. "That's good." He had no idea the protocol had changed. Her voice stayed calm, but the words carried weight. "We stopped the trial this morning." Ethan looked up at the screen again. "That's why the rooms are empty." "Yes." She rested her hands on the table. "The board is investigating several executives." Ethan didn't ask who. He already knew one of them, the calm voice from the stairwell. The man who had spoken about patients like they were statistics. Vivian continued. "They built an entire secondary protocol behind the official trials." "For what?" "Data." She said the word quietly. "Higher mortality rates produce faster results. Certain investors wanted accelerated outcomes." Ethan looked down at the coffee cup in his hands. "So they used terminal patients." Vivian didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice sounded tired. "Yes." The room fell quiet again. On the monitor, a nurse wheeled equipment down the corridor where patients had rested only a day earlier. Ethan thought about the older man in the third room, the way he had looked calmly through the glass. "Do the families know?" Ethan asked. Vivian nodded slowly. "They will." The pause that followed carried its own meaning. Lawyers, investigations, long explanations no one wanted to hear. Vivian looked back at Ethan. "You could have ignored what you heard." Ethan shrugged slightly. "Maybe. Most people would have." He didn't answer that. The truth was simpler. He had just kept listening, and once you listen long enough, sometimes the truth made silence harder. Vivian stood. "The board is removing several people from their positions tonight." She hesitated before continuing, "and they're restructuring the clinical trial oversight program." Ethan looked at her. "Good." She studied him quietly. "You're still working the night shift?" "Yeah. You shouldn't have to." Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Vivian reached into her jacket pocket and placed a small card on the table. "Hospital information. Specialized treatment access." He looked at it without touching it. "What is that?" "An experimental therapy program. For Laya." The name made him look up quickly. Vivian met his eyes. The real one. Ethan's throat tightened. "You looked into my records. You saved my brother's life." "That's not why I told you." "I know." She pushed the card closer to him. "But it matters." Ethan stared at the card for a long moment. Then he picked it up. The program name was unfamiliar, but the hospital listed beneath it wasn't. It was the same place where Laya slept under soft lights and quiet machines. "How soon?" he asked. "They can review her case this week." He nodded slowly. The room felt very quiet. On the security monitor, the observation corridor lights dimmed as the building moved deeper into the night cycle. Vivian stood. "There's something else." Ethan waited. "We're creating a new patient oversight department." He frowned. "For the trials?" Vivian's voice stayed steady. "Someone who understands what happens when no one listens." Ethan looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "I'm a janitor. You're someone who paid attention." She left the sentence there. No pressure, just the possibility. After a moment, she walked toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped. "The building will look different tomorrow." Then she stepped into the hallway. The door closed quietly behind her. Ethan remained in the break room for a while. The monitors continued flickering. Empty corridors, quiet labs, rooms where machines had been removed. He finished the coffee, then stood and pushed the cart back into the hallway. There were still floors to clean, work to do, but as he moved through the building, something about the place felt lighter. Not fixed, not healed, just different. Later that morning, he stopped by the hospital again. Laya was awake. The dragon drawing still sat on the table beside her bed. The wings were blue now. "Did you finish it?" she asked. "Yeah." He handed her the card Vivian had given him. "What's that?" she asked. "Another treatment to look at." She studied the card carefully, then looked back at him. "Is it a good one?" Ethan thought about the quiet hallway, the half-open door, the voices he wasn't supposed to hear, and the long chain of decisions that had followed. Finally, he nodded. "I think it might be." Leia smiled slightly, then picked up the blue crayon again. Ethan sat beside the bed watching her color. Outside the hospital window, the early sunlight spread slowly across the city. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel completely closed, not certain, not easy, but open enough that it was worth trying. And sometimes Ethan realized quietly that was enough.